Sometimes salvation comes dressed as the very thing that might destroy you. High in the Colorado Rockies, where winter winds carry the ghosts of forgotten dreams, Ezra Blackwood's cabin sits like a scar against the white wilderness. For 5 years he's lived with only the company of his guilt and the memory of flames that took everything he loved. The locals whisper he went mad after watching his wife and daughter burn, that he talks to shadows and shoots at sounds that aren't there. But when a half-dead woman stumbles through his door, calling him beautiful with lips blue from cold, something awakens in Ezra that he thought the fire had killed. Her name is Celia, she says, and she's running from masters who would see her dead. What Ezra doesn't know is that this trembling woman holds secrets that could unravel everything he believes about mercy, justice, and the price of love. In a world where ownership of another human being is legal, where can two broken souls find freedom? And what happens when the very lie that brings them together becomes the truth that might tear them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The woman's weight against his chest felt like holding a sparrow, all fragile bones and desperate heartbeat. Ezra hadn't touched another human being in 3 years, not since old Henrik died of the lung fever down in Timber Creek. Now this slip of a thing had collapsed into his arms, her dark skin almost grey with cold ice crystals frozen in her hair like a crown of suffering. "Easy now," he murmured, though his voice came out rough as tree bark from disuse. "I got you." She stirred against him, eyes fluttering open, brown as creek stones, wide with terror that softened when they focused on his face. Her lips moved again, barely a whisper. Handsome, like an angel. Something cracked inside Ezra's chest, a sound like lake ice breaking in spring. No one had looked at him with anything but fear or pity since the fire carved its story across the left side of his face, melting his ear and pulling his mouth into a permanent grimace. Even before the scars, he'd been a hard man to look upon, too tall, too broad, with eyes the color of winter storms. But this woman, this Celia, saw something else entirely. He kicked the cabin door shut behind him and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. The sound echoed through the small space like a gunshot. Outside, the wind howled its approval, rattling the shutters he'd built to keep the world at bay. "Mine," he whispered to the empty room, though he wasn't sure if he meant the woman in his arms or this moment of grace she'd brought him. Mine. The cabin welcomed them with blessed warmth from the stone fireplace Ezra had built with his own hands. Thick bear pelts covered the rough-hewn floor, and dried herbs hung from the rafters, his own rough attempts at healing the wounds that never seemed to close. He carried Celia to the bed in the corner, the same bed where he'd lain broken and raging after the fire, the same bed where nightmares still visited him most nights. Her dress was little more than rags, coarse brown cloth that spoke of servitude and suffering. But underneath the grime and exhaustion, Ezra caught glimpses of something that didn't fit. Her hands, when he peeled away her frozen mittens, were soft despite the recent calluses. Her speech, what little he'd heard, carried an education that seemed at odds with her circumstances. Not that it mattered. Nothing mattered except the way she'd looked at him like he was worth saving. He built up the fire until orange light danced across the cabin walls, chasing away shadows that usually whispered of death and failure. From his meager supplies, he heated water and strips of venison, preparing what comfort he could offer. His hands shook as he worked, not from cold, but from the strangeness of caring for another living soul. "Where did you come from?" he asked when she stirred again, accepting sips of warm broth from his wooden spoon. "How far did you travel?" Fear flickered across her features. "South," she whispered. "Been walking for days. They'll be coming for me soon." "Who will?" "Master Thornfield's men. They got dogs and horses and—" She shuddered, pulling the blanket he'd wrapped around her closer. "They don't take kindly to property that runs." The word property hit Ezra like a physical blow. He'd heard the arguments, seen the newspaper articles that sometimes made their way up to the trading posts. But here in his mountain isolation, such things had seemed distant as fairy tales. Now slavery had a face, exhausted and beautiful, and trusting him with secrets that could get them both killed. "How long?" he asked. "Since you found me. Or since I ran." "Since you ran." "Week, maybe more. Hard to tell when you're sleeping in snowdrifts and eating tree bark." She managed a weak smile that transformed her whole face. "But I'm free now. However long it lasts, I'm free." Ezra studied her face in the firelight, memorizing every detail like a man seeing sunrise after years of darkness. "What made you say it?" "Say what?" "That I was—" He couldn't repeat the word handsome, couldn't make his scarred mouth form something so foreign to his experience. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You saved me from dying in the snow. That makes you beautiful, scars or no scars." The simple honesty of it nearly undid him. For 5 years, he'd been nothing but a ghost haunting these mountains, jumping at every sound, seeing his dead family in every shadow. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be human, to matter to another soul. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin like something hungry trying to get in. Or maybe something hungry trying to keep them from getting out. Ezra moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. Nothing but swirling white darkness. But somewhere out there, men with dogs and ropes were following a trail that led straight to his door. He turned back to find Celia watching him with those creek stone eyes, and made a decision that would damn them both. "Then you'll stay," he said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains. "Whatever's coming, we'll face it together." The morning after brought a silence so complete it hurt Ezra's ears. He'd grown accustomed to the mountain's usual symphony, whined through pine boughs, the distant crack of settling ice, the scurry of small creatures in the walls. But today, the world held its breath, as if nature itself was hiding from what hunted in the white. Celia slept curled beneath his heaviest bear pelt, one small hand pressed against her cheek like a child. Ezra had spent the night in his chair by the fire, rifle across his knees, listening for the sound of dogs baying in the distance. None had come, but his shoulders still ached with tension that 5 years of mountain living had carved into his bones. This was his world, this careful dance with solitude and survival. Every morning the same ritual: check the trap lines, mend what the cold had broken, prepare for another night of keeping death at bay. He'd built this life deliberately sparse, owning only what could be carried if he needed to run, trusting no one who might discover what he'd fled from back in Missouri. But now she was here, disrupting everything with her soft breathing and the way sunlight caught in her dark hair. He moved carefully around the cabin, performing his morning tasks with the quiet precision of a man who'd learned that noise could mean discovery. Water from the barrel he'd filled before the last storm, coffee beans he rationed like gold, grinding them between 2 stones, bread that was mostly cornmeal and hope, but it filled the belly and kept a man moving. Celia stirred when the coffee's aroma filled the small space. Her eyes opened slowly, taking in unfamiliar rafters before finding his face across the room. The fear that flickered there, just for a moment, before memory returned, reminded him how fragile this strange sanctuary really was. "Morning," she whispered, sitting up carefully. "You didn't sleep." "Sleep's a luxury." He poured coffee into his one spare cup, brought it to her with steady hands that belied the tremor in his chest. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses." She accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the steam. "But alive, that's more than I hoped for yesterday." Ezra nodded, understanding the mathematics of survival better than most. He'd spent 5 years calculating odds, how long his supplies would last, whether that distant gunshot meant danger, if the dreams that woke him screaming would ever let him sleep through a night. Adding another person to those equations changed everything. "I need to check the trap lines," he said, though what he really needed was to scout for signs of pursuit. "There's food by the fire, and water for washing. Bar the door behind me." Something shifted in her expression. "How long will you be gone?" "Few hours. Maybe less if the weather turns." He pulled on his heavy coat, the one sewn from pelts of animals he'd killed with his own hands. "Don't answer if anyone comes calling. Don't even breathe loud." She nodded, but he caught the tightness around her eyes. This woman had run through a winter that killed strong men, had survived on tree bark and desperation, yet the thought of being left alone frightened her. It reminded him of Sarah, his sister, who used to wait by the window when he worked late in the fields, afraid the darkness might swallow him whole. The memory hit, like a physical blow. Sarah's laugh echoing through their farmhouse kitchen. Her small hands helping him shell peas on the front porch. The way she'd called his name as the flames took her. "Ezra?" Celia's voice pulled him back from that precipice. "You went somewhere dark just then." He forced his breathing to steady. "Old ghosts. They follow me sometimes." "Mine too," she said quietly. "Seems like we're both running from something." The simple truth of it hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. Ezra had spent so long carrying his secrets alone that the possibility of sharing their weight seemed impossible. But this woman, with her creekstone eyes and gentle honesty, made him want to try. Instead, he checked his rifle one more time and lifted the door bar. "Keep the fire burning. Don't let it die while I'm gone." Outside, the world was carved from crystal and silence. His snowshoes crunched through powder that came up past his knees, each step a deliberate choice in a landscape that punished mistakes. These mountains had been his refuge and his prison, protecting him from a world that wanted answers he couldn't give, while slowly grinding his soul to dust with their isolation. But now Celia was warming herself by his fire, drinking coffee from his cup, existing in the space where only ghosts had lived for 5 years. The thought of returning to find her gone, taken by bounty hunters or claimed by the cold, made something clench in his chest like a fist around his heart. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have something worth losing. The rediscovery was both salvation and damnation, and he wasn't sure which would destroy him first. The first trap held nothing but wind-scattered snow, the bait taken by something clever enough to avoid the steel jaws. Ezra reset it with practiced efficiency, his thick gloves clumsy but necessary in the biting cold. The second trap told a different story, rabbit tracks leading away from the spring mechanism, as if the animal had sensed danger and fled. Something was wrong. In 5 years of working these lines, he'd learned to read the mountain's moods like scripture. Animals didn't abandon easy meals without cause. They ran from fire, from predators, from... The distant sound froze his blood. Dogs baying, still miles away but unmistakable in the thin air. 3, maybe 4 hounds working a trail, their voices carrying promises of violence across the white silence. Ezra dropped the trap and reached for his rifle, scanning the tree line with eyes that had learned to see death coming from long distances. Nothing moved except wind-stirred branches, but the sound came again, closer now, following the natural corridors between peaks that any tracker worth his salt would use. They'd found her trail. Found his. He abandoned the remaining traps and started back toward the cabin, snowshoes biting deep as he pushed harder than the terrain wanted to allow. Each step became a prayer to a god he'd stopped believing in somewhere between Missouri and these mountains. Let me reach her first. Let me reach her first. The cabin appeared through the pines like salvation, smoke still rising straight and innocent from the chimney. Ezra burst through the door so hard it slammed against the wall, making Celia jump from where she sat mending her tattered dress. "They're coming," he said, dropping the bar into place with hands that shook from more than cold. "Dogs, maybe men. We've got minutes, not hours." The color drained from her face, but she didn't fall apart. Instead, she stood with a kind of composure that spoke of practice, of other emergencies faced and survived. "How many?" "Don't know. Sound carries strange up here." He moved to the back wall where loose boards concealed his emergency cache, extra ammunition, dried food, the money he'd never spent because there was nothing worth buying. "Can you travel? Hard travel, through deep snow?" "I can do whatever keeps me breathing." She was already pulling on the wool socks he'd given her, wrapping her feet with strips of cloth he'd cut from an old shirt. "Where do we go?" Ezra hesitated. For 5 years, his escape plan had been simple. grab what he could carry and disappear into the high country where only mountain goats and madmen dared to tread. But that plan had been for one man traveling light, not a woman still recovering from near death. The baying came again, definitely closer. Through the small window, he caught movement between the trees, dark shapes flowing through white landscape like spilled ink. "There's a place," he said, shouldering his pack and checking his rifle one more time. "Old mining cave about 2 miles up the ridge. Hard to find if you don't know where to look. And if they do know," he met her eyes, seeing his own desperation reflected there. "Then we make our stand where the ground favors us instead of them." Celia nodded and reached for her tattered shawl, but Ezra stopped her. From his emergency supplies, he pulled a heavy coat he'd sewn from wolf pelts, too big for her small frame but warm enough to keep the mountain from claiming another victim. "This will serve you better," he said, helping her into sleeves that hung past her fingertips. The intimacy of the gesture, standing close enough to smell the lavender she'd somehow managed to preserve through her ordeal, made his hands fumble with the fastenings. "Ezra." Her voice was soft, but it stopped him cold. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." The question hung between them, like smoke from the fire he was about to abandon. Why was he risking everything for a woman he'd known less than 24 hours? Why was he prepared to face armed men and winter mountains for someone whose last name he didn't even know? The answer came from a place deeper than thought, from the part of him that remembered what it felt like to be human, instead of just a scarred thing haunting empty places. "Because you called me handsome," he said simply. "Because you looked at me like I was worth saving." Outside, the dogs had found their scent. The baying turned urgent, hungry, as boots crunched through snow toward the cabin where Ezra had finally found something worth protecting. He opened the back door, the one hidden behind stacked firewood, the one he'd built for exactly this moment, and stepped into wind that cut like broken glass. "Stay close," he told Celia, checking that her small hands were properly wrapped. "Step where I step. And whatever happens, don't look back." Behind them, the first shouts echoed through the pines as men found his cabin still warm, his secrets still burning in the hearth. The hunt had begun. The first 50 yards nearly killed them both. Ezra had planned this escape route in theory, marking landmarks during countless solitary hunts. But theory crumbled against the reality of breaking trail through waist-deep powder, while a woman half his size struggled to keep pace. Every step became a brutal negotiation between speed and survival, his snowshoes sinking deeper than they should, Celia's smaller frame disappearing entirely into drifts that swallowed her like hungry mouths. "I can't," she gasped, after the third time she'd fallen behind, her breath coming in sharp white puffs that dissipated too quickly in the thin air. "Ezra, I'm slowing you down. Leave me." He stopped so abruptly, she nearly collided with his broad back. When he turned, something dangerous flickered in his winter storm eyes. Not anger, but a kind of desperate fury that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the voices growing louder behind them. "Don't," he said, the word carrying the weight of mountains. "Don't you dare ask me to become that kind of man again." The "again" hung between them like a confession, but before Celia could pass its meaning, the baying erupted closer, maybe half a mile, close enough to hear individual voices distinguishing scents from shadows. 4 hounds, he counted, maybe 5, enough to run down anything that bled. Ezra's hands shook as he adjusted his pack straps, and for the first time since she'd known him, fear cracked through his mountain-carved composure. Not fear of the men pursuing them, she realized, but fear of what would happen if those men succeeded. Fear of losing something he'd convinced himself he could protect. "The cave," she said quietly. "How much farther?" "1.5 miles. Maybe 2. His voice carried no confidence, just the hollow sound of a man calculating odds that kept coming up wrong. "Straight up through terrain that'll break horses and probably us." "Then we need to move different." Celia studied the slope ahead, her mind working through problems with the kind of analytical precision that had kept her alive this long. "They're tracking our trail, not us. What if we gave them something else to follow?" Ezra frowned. not understanding, but she was already moving. Not up toward the cave, but laterally across the slope, toward a section where wind-scoured rock broke through the snow cover. "Help me with these," she said, struggling to remove his oversized snowshoes. "What are you?" Creating doubt. She kicked free of the bindings and immediately sank to her knees, but kept moving toward the rocks with grim determination. "Your trail leads one way, mine leads another. When they reach this point, they have to choose." The plan formed as she spoke it, desperate and probably doomed, but better than simply running until exhaustion claimed them. She would leave obvious tracks heading west toward the lower valleys, while Ezra continued up toward the cave. The dogs might split their pursuit, buying precious time, or they might follow the fresher scent and leave him free to circle back. No. Ezra's voice cracked like breaking timber. "I won't leave you to face them alone. You won't be leaving me." She was already stripping off the wolf pelt coat, the cold hitting her like a physical blow. "You'll be saving me. This only works if one of us reaches safety." But even as she spoke, doubt crept through her chest like ice water. What was she asking him to become? She'd seen the way he looked at her, like she was salvation instead of just another lost soul fleeing through the snow. If she died drawing off their pursuers, would she be saving him or destroying whatever hope had flickered to life in his scarred heart? The voices were close enough now to distinguish words. "Trail splits here, and bring thunder forward. Let him sort the scents." Men who knew their business, who'd done this before. Ezra stared at her with something approaching agony, his hands opening and closing like he wanted to grab her, hold her, make the world stop long enough to find a better choice. "I can't," he whispered. "I found you. I can't just—" "Yes, you can." But her own voice betrayed her, trembling with cold and terror, and something deeper, the awful recognition that she might be asking him to survive losing her when he'd already lost everything else that mattered. "Because you're stronger than whatever broke you before. Because you deserve to live, scars and all." Above them, snow began to fall. Fat flakes that would cover their tracks within the hour, erasing all evidence of this moment when two desperate souls had to choose between dying together and living apart. Ezra closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, she saw the exact moment he accepted what necessity demanded of them both. His face went empty, carved from stone and winter, the expression of a man preparing to become a ghost again. "The cave," he said hollowly. "If you can lose them, follow the ridge north until you find a lightning-split pine. 30 yards east, there's a rockfall that hides the entrance. Behind them, the first hound crested the rise, its triumphant bay echoing off granite walls like the sound of fate closing in. The hound's cry shattered the last moment of choice between them." Ezra's hand closed around Celia's wrist, his grip desperate and final, as if he could hold her to this world through will alone. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, she thought he might refuse, might drag her up the mountain with him. Damn the consequences, damn the odds that would kill them both. Then his fingers opened like prayer, releasing hope to heaven. "Go," he whispered. But the word came out broken, carved from some deep place where his ghosts lived. "Go now, before I lose what's left of my courage." Celia pressed something into his palm, a small wooden cross, worn smooth by desperate fingers. "So you remember," she said. "So you know I chose this freely." She turned and ran before either of them could change their minds, plunging down the slope toward voices that promised violence. Behind her, she heard Ezra's sharp intake of breath, the sound of a man watching his salvation disappear into white death. Then his snowshoes bit deep into snow as he climbed toward the high country, each step taking him further from everything he'd found and back toward the emptiness he'd spent 5 years perfecting. This was the threshold. Not the cabin door he'd barricaded against the world, but this moment when he chose to trust that love could exist even when split by mountains and terror. For 5 years he'd believed that caring meant losing, that connection only created new ways to bleed. Now he climbed through falling snow toward an uncertain cave, carrying nothing but hope that a woman brave enough to draw death away from him might also be clever enough to survive it. The voices below grew confused, fragmented, hounds baying in different directions as scents scattered like prayers on the wind. Ezra didn't look back, couldn't look back, because turning around would mean seeing her small figure growing smaller against the vast white, and that sight might break the fragile thing in his chest that was learning to beat with purpose again. His legs found rhythm in the punishing climb, muscle memory from years of fleeing through terrain that killed lesser men. But this time felt different. Before, he'd run from his past, from accusations that followed him out of Missouri like smoke from burning homes. Now he ran towards something, the possibility that two broken people might forge something whole from their shared wreckage. The lightning-split pine appeared through swirling snow like a monument to survival. 30 yards east, just as he'd told her, the rockfall concealed an opening barely wide enough for his shoulders. Ezra squeezed through granite teeth into darkness that smelled of bear and mineral water, into the sanctuary he'd prepared for solitude but now offered to hope. Inside, the cave opened into surprising space, high enough to stand, deep enough to hide, with a crack in the ceiling that would draw smoke safely away from any fire. He'd cached supplies here over the years, dry wood, canned goods, blankets that smelled of wood smoke and loneliness. Everything needed to wait out winter or pursuit, or the long nights when memories became too heavy to carry. But now the darkness felt different. Instead of refuge, it seemed like a tomb, a place where he might wait forever for footsteps that would never come, for a voice that called him handsome like an angel. He built a small fire with hands that shook from more than cold, each flame a beacon she might never see, each spark a prayer to bring her home to him. Outside, the wind carried distant sounds, shouting that might have been triumph or frustration, dog voices raised in confusion or discovery. Impossible to know which, impossible to do anything but tend his fire and listen to his own heartbeat counting moments like a funeral drum. This was what crossing the threshold truly meant. Not the dramatic moment of choice, but the long afterward, when commitment became endurance and hope became an act of will. Ezra had spent 5 years learning to live without expecting anything from tomorrow. Now he had to learn something infinitely harder, how to believe that tomorrow might bring joy instead of just survival. He pulled out the wooden cross she'd given him, worn smooth by hands that had known desperation long before they found his cabin. Such a small thing to carry so much weight, proof that their connection had been real, that the woman who'd seen beauty in his scars had existed beyond his desperate imagination. The fire settled into steady warmth as snow continued falling outside, erasing trails and evidence, covering the mountain in fresh possibility. Ezra settled against the cave wall and began the hardest work of his life, believing that love could survive separation, that courage could bridge distance, that a woman brave enough to call him handsome might also be strong enough to find her way back to where he waited. In the darkness beyond his fire, the mountain held its breath and kept their secrets safe. The fire had burned low when the first sound reached him, not the wind he'd grown accustomed to, but something deliberate. Footsteps crunching through snow, careful and measured, approaching the rockfall that concealed his sanctuary. Ezra's hand found his rifle before conscious thought engaged. 5 years of survival had taught him to distinguish between the random sounds of wilderness and the purposeful movement of men with intentions. This was the latter, though something felt wrong about the rhythm. Too light for the bounty hunters, too cautious for someone who knew exactly where to find him. "Ezra!" The voice that whispered through granite cracks made his heart stop entirely. "Are you in there?" He was moving before the words fully registered, scrambling toward the cave mouth with desperate urgency. Celia's face appeared in the narrow opening, pale as moonlight, her dark eyes huge in a face carved sharp by exhaustion and cold. Blood had frozen in dark lines along one cheek, where branches had torn skin, and her lips held the blue tinge that spoke of deep cold's hunger. "How?" he began, but she was already squeezing through the opening, falling more than stepping into his arms. Her small body shook against his chest, tremors that went deeper than mere cold, the kind of shaking that came from dancing too long with death. "Followed your directions," she managed through chattering teeth. "Lightning split pine, 30 yards east. Just like you said. But even as relief flooded through him like warm whiskey, practical concerns reasserted themselves. The bounty hunters hadn't simply vanished into the storm. If Celia had found his cave, others could too. The men following us, gone. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes, and he saw something new there, not just exhaustion, but a kind of grim satisfaction. For now, anyway. I led them down into Morgan's Draw, then doubled back when the snow got heavy enough to cover my tracks. Morgan's Draw. Ezra knew the place, a box canyon that dead-ended against sheer rock walls, the kind of trap that could occupy searchers for hours while they tried to find where a trail simply ended. Clever, but dangerous as hell for the person doing the leading. You could have been killed, he said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. If they'd caught you in there. But they didn't. Her hands found his face, fingers tracing the familiar landscape of scars with touch gentle as prayer. And now we have time to figure out what comes next. What comes next? The words hung between them like smoke from the fire, carrying weight neither of them had fully considered during their desperate flight. Ezra had spent so long focused on immediate survival, get her warm, get her fed, get her safe, that he hadn't looked beyond the crisis to whatever lay waiting on the other side. They'll be back, he said quietly. Men like that don't give up easy, and winter won't last forever. Celia nodded, but her expression held something he couldn't quite read. Calculation, maybe, or the kind of careful consideration that suggested she'd been thinking about this problem longer than the few hours they'd been separated. Tell me about the country north of here, past the high passes, toward the territorial border. Rough country, few settlements, fewer roads. Why? Because rough country makes for poor hunting if you don't know the terrain. She moved closer to the fire, her movements careful in a way that suggested new injuries hidden beneath the wolf pelt coat. And because I'm starting to think running isn't enough anymore. We need to disappear completely. The word "we" hit him like a physical blow, carrying implications that made his scarred hands shake. For so long, survival had been a solitary endeavor, one man against the mountain, against the past, against the long loneliness that carved away everything soft about living. The idea of building something permanent with another person, of planning beyond the next meal or the next storm, felt foreign as speaking in tongues. Celia. Her name came out rough, weighted with questions he wasn't sure how to ask. You don't owe me anything. When spring comes, when it's safe to travel, stop. The word cut through his fumbling offer like a blade through leather. You think this is about debt, about obligation? She was standing now, silhouetted against firelight, and something in her posture reminded him of a general surveying a battlefield, calculating, determined, preparing to fight for ground worth holding. You saved my life, yes, but I chose to come back here. Chose to follow that lightning-split tree through snow that could have killed me, because this... She gestured between them, at the small space they'd made warm and safe in the heart of winter. This is worth fighting for. Outside, wind howled through granite peaks like the voices of ghosts. But inside their sanctuary, something new was taking shape. Not just survival, but the radical possibility of building a life that went beyond merely breathing. Ezra looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the woman who'd called him handsome, but someone who'd chosen to bind her fate to his with full knowledge of what that choice might cost them both. The fire crackled between them like a living thing, throwing shadows that danced across cave walls and transformed their small sanctuary into something that felt almost sacred. Ezra stared at Celia, this woman who'd risked everything to return to him, and felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crack like ice in spring thaw. Worth fighting for, he repeated, testing the words like a man learning a foreign language. For 5 years nothing had been worth fighting for except the grim satisfaction of seeing another dawn. Now she stood before him, bloodied and exhausted but unbroken, talking about building something permanent in a world that had taught him everything beautiful eventually burned. You don't understand what you're asking. The words came out harsher than he intended, but she needed to know. needed to see past whatever romantic notion had brought her back through killing snow to this cave. I'm not just running from bounty hunters, Celia. There are things in my past, things that follow a man no matter how far he travels. Tell me. She settled beside him, close enough that he could feel warmth radiating from her small body, close enough to see the determination burning in her dark eyes. If we're going to disappear together, I need to know what we're disappearing from. Ezra's hands clenched and unclenched in his lap. He'd never spoken of Missouri to anyone, had buried those memories so deep he sometimes convinced himself they belonged to someone else. But if they were going to have any chance of survival, she deserved the truth about the man she'd chosen to trust. There was a family, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. The Hartmans, settlers trying to make a go of it on the frontier. I was guiding them through territory that— He stopped, swallowed hard. Territory that turned violent while we were crossing it. Border war between Kansas and Missouri, neighbor killing neighbor over slavery, over politics, over old grudges that had nothing to do with decent people just trying to live. The fire popped, sending sparks toward the cave ceiling, and Ezra watched them rise and die like the ghosts of better possibilities. I got them killed, made choices that put them in the wrong place at the wrong time, and when the smoke cleared, there were 6 graves that shouldn't have existed, and one guide who walked away when he should have died with them. Celia was quiet for a long moment, studying his profile in the firelight. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no judgment, only careful understanding. That's why you live alone up here. Why you looked like you'd seen a ghost when I called you handsome. A man who gets people killed doesn't deserve kindness. The admission scraped his throat raw. Doesn't deserve to be called anything but what he is. And what's that? Dangerous. To anyone fool enough to trust him. She reached across the space between them and took his scarred hands in hers, her touch firm despite the trembling that still ran through her from cold and exhaustion. You know what I think. I think you've been punishing yourself for surviving when others didn't. Living like a dead man because you couldn't save people you cared about. Her words hit too close to truth, made something raw and bleeding stir in his chest. You don't know. I know you could have left me to die in your cabin, she interrupted. Could have pointed those bounty hunters in the right direction and watched them take me away. Instead, you barricaded the door and declared me yours, like I was worth protecting against the whole damn world. The memory of that moment, her calling him handsome, the desperate possessiveness that had crashed over him like an avalanche, felt like it belonged to a different man. Someone who still believed he deserved good things, who could look at beauty without flinching. Maybe I was just selfish, he said. Maybe I kept you because I was tired of being alone. Maybe. Celia's thumb traced across his knuckles, following old scars with gentle precision. Or maybe you recognized something worth saving when you saw it. The way I recognized something worth returning to when I could have kept running toward safer territory. Outside the cave, wind moaned through granite peaks with the sound of winter digging in its claws. They had weeks, maybe months before spring opened the high passes enough for serious travel. Time enough for the bounty hunters to regroup, to bring in more men, to tighten the net until escape became impossible. But time enough, too, for other things. For planning that went beyond mere survival. For deciding whether the bond forged between them in desperation could become something real enough to build a future on. The territorial border, Ezra said finally. There are places up there where the law gets thin, where 2 people could make a life if they were careful about it. Hard country, but— He met her eyes across the fire. But maybe hard country suits people like us. Celia smiled. The first real smile he'd seen from her since the bounty hunters appeared, and something that had been frozen in his chest for 5 long years began, finally, to thaw. But even as that fragile warmth bloomed between them, the sound that shattered their moment of peace came like God's own judgment, the distant baying of hounds, closer than any dog should be, carrying on wind that had shifted without warning. Ezra was on his feet before the echo died, rifle in hand, every muscle coiled with the terrible recognition of pursuit closing in. The fire that had seemed like salvation now felt like a beacon calling death straight to their door. "How?" Celia whispered, but even as the question left her lips, understanding dawned in her eyes like sickness. The smoke. They followed the smoke. The crack in the cave ceiling that had seemed like perfect ventilation now revealed itself as betrayal. In the still air of the storm's eye, the thin trail of smoke would be visible for miles, a grey finger pointing straight down at their hiding place, like an accusation from heaven. "The back passage," Ezra said, already moving toward the deeper shadows of the cave. "There's a way out through the mountain, but it's narrow, dangerous." But Celia wasn't moving. She stood frozen by the dying fire, her face pale as winter death, and when she looked at him, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice water. "There is no back passage," she said quietly. "Is there?" The question hung between them like a blade. Ezra's mouth opened, then closed, because the truth was written in every line of her posture, every shadow on her face. She'd known. Somehow, she'd known this cave was a trap the moment she'd squeezed through its narrow mouth. "How long have you known?" His voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. "Since I felt the air flow." Her hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from something infinitely worse. "There's only one way in or out of here, isn't there? That's why you chose it. Not as a hideout, but as a last stand." The hounds were closer now, their voices raised in the terrible harmony of predators who'd found the scent they sought. Mixed with their baying came human voices, rough with triumph and the promise of violence soon to come. Celia. Her name tasted like prayer and blasphemy all at once. "You have to understand." "Understand what?" The words came out sharp enough to cut, and when she turned to face him fully, he saw his own death reflected in her eyes. "That you brought me here to die, that everything you said about the territorial border, about building a life together, that was all lies to keep me calm while you picked out our tomb." No. The denial ripped from his throat like something vital being torn away. The border was real, the life was real. "But they found us too fast, and this is the only place we can make a stand that means anything." A stand. She laughed, and the sound held no humor, only the brittle edge of hysteria. "Against how many men? 5, 10? With what? 1 rifle and whatever ammunition you've cached here." The voices outside were close enough now to make out individual words. Orders being given, positions being taken. The methodical sounds of men who knew their quarry was trapped and could afford to be careful about the killing. "Enough to make it count," Ezra said, and meant it. "Enough to make them remember the price of hunting people like us." But even as he spoke, he could see the future unrolling before them, with terrible clarity. The narrow cave mouth that would funnel their attackers into kill zones would also trap them when their ammunition ran out. The men outside would have patience, supplies, reinforcements if needed. All they had was rage and desperation and whatever love had managed to bloom in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I should have kept running," Celia whispered, and the words hit him like physical blows. "Should have drawn them away instead of coming back here. If you'd kept running, you'd be dead by morning." Ezra moved toward her, slow and careful, like approaching a wild thing that might bolt. "At least this way. We have a chance." "What chance?" The question came out raw, scraped from the bottom of her fear. "To die together instead of apart. To make our last stand in a hole in the ground while they smoke us out like vermin." The sounds outside were organizing now. Men taking positions around the rockfall, voices discussing the best approach for a cave with only one entrance. Professional voices that spoke of money changing hands when the work was done. "The chance to choose how our story ends," Ezra said, and reached for her hands with fingers that no longer shook. "The chance to face what comes next as something more than we were alone." Outside their sanctuary, winter wind carried the promise of violence and the certainty of blood. Inside, 2 broken souls prepared to discover whether love born from desperation could burn bright enough to light their way into whatever darkness waited beyond the reach of earthly pursuit. The first shot came at dawn, a rifle crack that echoed through the cave like thunder trapped in stone. Rock chips exploded from the entrance, and Ezra jerked Celia deeper into the shadows as the sound rolled over them in waves. "Testing our position," he said, checking his rifle with hands that moved by instinct alone. "Seeing if we'll panic and do something stupid." But Celia wasn't listening. She sat pressed against the cave wall, staring at the narrow mouth of their prison with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd finally understood the true mathematics of their situation. Outside, voices called back and forth, at least 6 men, maybe more, with the patience of hunters who knew their quarry had nowhere left to run. "They don't even need to come in after us," she said quietly. "Do they?" Ezra's silence was answer enough. The bounty hunters had time, supplies, reinforcements if needed. All they had to do was wait for thirst or hunger, or simple desperation to drive their prey into the open. It was a siege, and sieges only ended one way when the defenders had no hope of relief. Another shot. Closer this time. The bullet whined off granite inches from where Celia's head had been moments before. Someone out there was getting impatient, or maybe just enjoying the sport of watching trapped animals flinch. "How long?" she asked. "Maybe 2 days without water. 3 if we're careful." "That's not what I meant." She turned to look at him, and the expression on her face made something cold settle in his stomach. "How long have you been planning this? The cave, the trap. When did you decide we were both going to die here?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "Celia, that's not—" "Isn't it?" She was standing now, backing away from him as if he'd become something dangerous. "You knew this place had no back exit, knew it was a dead end from the moment you brought me here, and you let me talk about the territorial border, about building a life together, when you'd already chosen our grave. I was trying to give us a chance." The words exploded from him with the force of 5 years' worth of buried guilt. Every other option meant certain death. "At least here we can—" "Can what?" "Take a few of them with us?" Her voice cracked like breaking ice. "Make our deaths mean something by adding more bodies to the pile?" Another shot. This one came from a different angle, suggesting their attackers were spreading out, taking careful positions for whatever came next. Professional work that spoke of men who'd done this kind of hunting before. "You want to know the truth?" Ezra's grip tightened on his rifle until his knuckles showed white. "I've been dead for 5 years, dead since I got the Hartman family killed, dead since I realized that everything I touch turns to ash and blood. When you called me handsome, when you made me feel human again, maybe I thought if I was going to finally stop running, I could at least die protecting something worth dying for." The words hung between them like smoke from a guttering fire. Celia stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. Horror, maybe, or something closer to pity. "So that's what I am to you," she said finally. "Not a woman with her own choices, her own plans for survival. Just your chance at redemption. Your beautiful death." Before he could answer, the sound they'd both been dreading echoed from the cave mouth. Heavy footsteps, confident and unhurried. Their hunters had finished their preparations and were coming to collect what they'd been paid for. $500 for the woman," a voice called from just outside rifle range. "Dead or alive, though alive pays better." "You want to discuss terms, Mountain Man, or do we do this the hard way?" Ezra moved toward the cave entrance, but Celia's hand caught his arm. When he looked back, her face had gone pale as winter death, and something like recognition flickered in her dark eyes. "I know that voice," she whispered. "Celia?" The name came from outside, spoken with the casual familiarity of old acquaintance. "Celia, honey, time to stop playing games. Your family's worried sick about you." The rifle slipped from Ezra's suddenly nerveless fingers. He turned to stare at the woman he'd thought he was protecting, the woman he'd been ready to die for, and saw a stranger looking back at him. "Your family," he repeated, his voice flat as winter stone. Celia, if that was even her real name, closed her eyes like someone preparing for execution. "There are things I haven't told you," she said. "Things about who I really am." Outside, men laughed with the easy confidence of hunters who'd found their prey exactly where they expected it to be. Inside, the last illusions of a desperate man crumbled like ash in his hands.